Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review the first 3 episodes of Kemono Jihen. I hope I said that right. I'm going to be questioning a lot of the names of which that I'm going to try and pronounce, just because names usually slip my mind with anything. So normally I find out or I figure out some way to eventually find the names of things. So eventually I can figure out a way to try and say them while, of course, trying to review things. Because I usually try and am like good with the whole like figuring out the story, but the names also lose me. So going into this show, and in the first 3 episodes, the only real problem of which that I have about this show is I'm not quite understanding like the terminology of things, or I'm not really quite quickly catching up on like the layman's terms of this world that is to be like given to us. Like uh I don't know, they can really just condense down that like, hey, this kind of thing is this name, but I'm just like, I still don't quite understand this. But it seems like whenever there is to be a human slash monstrous thing, usually that comes down to the word kimono for a lot of times. But again, it's me trying to like figure out this world, and I haven't quite done that yet in 3 episodes, but eventually we'll get there. So I wish there was an oversimplification, and but maybe I just missed that. Like there's a lot of the technical sides when you just get people spouting out names, and I'm just like, I man, like I don't know, I just feel like dumb or ignorant when eventually it just seems that uh like there's like technical stuff that I just couldn't understand, just because I'm not that intelligent. So I'm hoping eventually we'll get there, or really I'll just enjoy the ride of which that we have upon this show, and I will still probably never understand the technical side of all of it, the technical wording and whatever. But here's what I did pick up on, because I had to research a little bit of this stuff afterwards. So we end up having a kid in this first episode who ends up being at first called Doro Tabo, and he is to be a kid who is to be half human, half ghoul. And it seems that we end up getting some monsters this in these episodes, and we also end up getting this interesting kind of like enemy in this show that, or it seems to be an enemy. We're not quite like, I'm not quite 100% sure yet, because we only have one real episode of this to figure out whether this person is going to be an enemy or an ally, or because it seems that reasonably, when it seems like there's a person to be an enemy, all of a sudden it's to not really be the case. Case in point, episode 3. So going into this, we end up seemingly having characters that have certain kind of abilities. Like we end up through like this early stages, we end up having Dorotabo, who is to actually be called Kabane. Kabane? I'm hoping ballparkingly pronouncing that correct. Kusaka? Kabane Kusaka. Our main character here with the skeleton hoodie that evidently was originally actually Shiki's. Oh my god. We're pink haired guy with web jacket that we see up top there. Man, these are going to be some interesting things to say and talk about and whatever. Inugame is to be this detective that we end up seeing right here, the kind of blonde haired guy. We end up having him going off to this farm in the middle of nowhere to investigate some kind of disturbance at this farm, and he ends up bumping into Kabane's character, and he ends up finding out that this kid is to own a life stone, which is on his necklace, and he's like, "Wow, that's kind of rare." So we immediately get Inugame, who is to say that this kid is to be like not exactly abandoned and that there's something special about him, and like, so I'm assuming that this has to be some kind of Harry Potter kind of situation where all of a sudden, like, this kid may be the chosen one and we don't know, or maybe he is some kind of rare maybe he is just some uberly rare Keanu Reeves Neo the One character, and we're not sure about all that. But it seems that eventually that Kabane eventually is to seemingly be able to be better than a lot of the other characters for whatever reason. It seems like if you're going to have a mission, this kid needs to be front and center and be a part of seemingly every mission, or basically just go ahead and do the mission while everyone just sits back and just kind of collects their check or whatever they get from this whole investigation. Like, besides the whole me not quite understanding the whole world of this yet, the whole scope of this whole thing yet, like, this almost kind of comes off as like Ghostbusters, where when like the police officers can't quite figure out how to be able to uh, like solve this case, they end up giving it to these guys, the Kemono like detective agency, and they have to kind of figure things out. So, and how is it that they can just get in touch with, especially Inugame? How can exactly can they figure out, uh, like, how to get a hold of him? Is it that easy? Like, do they kind of like, is the internet just like, hey, where is like a detective that can easily solve all my supernatural needs? And this is guy number one to call. Anyways, so but yeah, so it seems like really like the first three episodes are kind of setting up the roster of who is to kind of be involved in this detective agency. But man, am I kind of really liking like the stories of these people. It seems that we have certain characters with certain abilities. One girl who's to be named Cone is to be able to seemingly transform from human to eventually this like werewolf esh like character with this flaming tail. And I'm like, what is this? Cone, the girl that has like the earrings that are, or the ears that are right there coming popping out of the hoodie, because like if she ends up taking her off, you can actually see her ears. Um, and we have uh, Shu uh, Shuki Shiki, the guy with the hooded uh, web jacket. He ends up having like supposedly silk powers, but he's basically Spider Man. Like, he's pretty much Spider Man, um, but he has just like the web jacket. Funny enough, supposedly Kabane, who is right here, who is in the middle here, uh, is to have eventually taken that guy's hoodie, which I thought was kind of funny. So, like, because this guy had no clothes. Kabani really had no clothes because he just kind of went off to eventually just be taken to this home because he had nowhere else to go. So it seems we end up finding out that a lot of these kids end up being abandoned and scooped up by this detective who is Inugame. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. I'm probably not. And uh, Kohashi? Kohashi? Kohashi might be better, might be easier. Kohashi? Yeah, that might be easy to say. Uh, if I'm even. Kohashi is to seemingly be this detective that is to eventually find out about these kids, take them in, and then eventually use a lot of these kids for his cases. We within even 3 episodes, we still don't know what Akira can do. The girl that is up top here, that is very up top here. Don't know who this guy is quite yet, but I know he's on here somewhere. He has a name. Um, yeah, good luck with that. we'll get to that name when we get to it. Good grief. So yeah, we're learning people now, but yeah, these names aren't easy to pronounce. As well as the technical names also are like, hey, what is this thing? Good luck with any names of anything. If anybody knows a website where there's like names of everything, let me know all the technical whatever. Like I'm going through wikis and everything like that to try to find names and whatever for everything, but it's not that easy. So anyways, I've talked for this long enough. So check this out. It's a really cool supernatural anime. Where could you probably go? Well, there are certain kind of bootleg apps besides Funimation that you could probably go and watch these shows. YouTube at sometimes has like bootleg versions of this of certain kind of channels, or a certain kind of shows. I mean, anime shows. So you might be able to find this on YouTube somewhere. But I would use apps called like GoGo Anime. That seems to be kind of like a bootleg kind of app right now. You could probably check out maybe Amazon might have certain kind of things, or you could probably buy certain kind of seasons if you have money on you. Definitely go for the English dubbed things if that's what you really want, or maybe you want to just read a subtitle for a whole whatever. Um, but anyways, uh, go anime, or you could probably sift through or search through any number of kind of just bootlegish anime things through Google Play or some kind of something. You can probably find like a number of bootleg anime sites that eventually have all this stuff for free. Uh, but anyways, let's go into that double five time territory. Let's go and just talk about this. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time you spoil this movie or the show. So, very beginning of this, the very first episode is called Kabane because we're eventually to find out what this guy's actual name is, which is Kabane, of course, which is why this is titled this way. So, Kohashi is to go on to Kabane's aunt's home because this kid had been abandoned to go to his aunt's house, and so this kid is just consistently farming. It seems like this kid never goes to school because I guess because of maybe his awful scent and how, like, in the very beginning of this episode, we see like a bunch of kids that are just going and heckling this kid because of the way that he smells, and it's like, well, like, that's not his fault because he is consistently farming and having to really just be involved with stuff like manure and all kinds of mixture of farming things, which I guess eventually this kid starts to smell really ripe. But we end up also finding out that that is just also his really just his half ghoul scent, because this kid is half human, half ghoul. So yeah, so this kid is to reek just because he probably reeks and smells like half like death. So he can't help that. And eventually, uh, Kohashi is eventually going to give him a perfume to kind of muscle or musk that that scent. But that'll be kind of towards the next episode, or kind of towards the end of this episode. So, uh, so eventually, what ends up happening is Kobayashi is to go to this place and eventually just kind of like go into this bath and have supposedly uh, Yataro, who is to be Kobane's cousin. And so it seems like this girl desperately wants to go to like Tokyo, or kind of go to like the bigger places and the bigger towns and whatever. And so she thinks that if she kind of wins this guy over, that this girl will be taken to these towns and just given the high life for whatever reason. Like, that just seems so weird to me. So, so we end up having reasonably just Kobayashi, Kohachi, going and getting like rubbed down by this girl, and he's just like, you know what, like, I don't really have any interest in having this girl rub me down or whatever, but we end up having this guy just taking a liking to Gobane because he is to just be putting into the work and farming, and you can just tell that this like kid is just exhausted. So Kohashi mentions to Kabane's aunt that he wants to have Kabane like kind of wait for him and kind of like work for him, or kind of assist him in whatever he wants while he's there. So the aunt, like Kabane's aunt, doesn't tell this detective. See how I kind of saved it there? I'm just getting obviously tired of already having to say all these names. So, Kabane's aunt, who is Mrs. Kusaka, of course, obviously, right? So, Miss Kusaka is to send this guy in and have, but she doesn't even tell him why he's there. So this detective is to go on and ask Kabane, like, hey, like, do you know kind of why I'm here? Why I'm kind of having to investigate things? And so Kabane is to mention that there have been some chickens or some roosters that ended up getting killed in the middle of the night. And so I guess that's the main reason why this guy is here. This detective is here to now have to investigate why these roosters have gone slaughtered. It's like, well, like, is there any kind of animals that seem to consistently be here? Like, that seems like a weird thing to have, like a detective desperately needing to, like, this kind of seems overkill. Like, it's probably some wild animal or something like that. Like, it kind of is a weird conclusion of desperately needing some like supernatural detective to figure this out. So the detective ends up going with Kabane to just kind of like see what he does day to day, and like, so this detective just continues to follow this kid around and do and help him with all of these chores. And eventually this detective eventually gets exhausted just because it's like, God, like, I'm doing all this stuff. And but yeah, so what ends up happening is this guy is to notice, because this kid is like shirtless 24/7 seemingly. He notices this little like bone kind of stone kind of thing on this guy's necklace, and so he's like, "Hey, what is that?" And so Kabane gives the detective this stone. He's like, "Oh, this must be some kind of life stone." And Kabane is like, "Yeah, I must have got that from my parents. Like, for some reason, like, I've just always like worn it, and I never knew what it was." And so the detective is like, "Well, this stone is like very rare, and you wouldn't have like had this kind of stone if you were just abandoned. There had to have been a real legitimate reason for your parents to have left you. Uh, like maybe your life was in jeopardy, kind of thing, and so they had to just kind of like have you go to your aunts and kind of run off, so eventually you could be protected or something like that. Or like the detective is also thinking that maybe Kabane's parents are still alive, and maybe eventually this detective can find his parents for Kabane. And Kabane is like, wow, that sounds really nice. Like, that sounds like something really cool that eventually I might be able to meet my parents. So, eventually, what ends up happening is that Kabane also is to say that the last time that the roosters or the chickens were to be killed off in this barn or farm of theirs was to have been by the time of a new moon. And so the detective is just like, okay, well, that's good because if anything, like a new moon is going to be within the next X amount of days. So that time has passed. And so they end up going out to kind of figure out what had happened. So Kabane uh, is to eventually go off and kind of check like with the detective what is going on. And coincidentally, uh, we have Kabane who ends up bumping into uh, Taharo, and which is his cousin, and she is to be frustrated with Kabane because she wanted to go to Tokyo, and she believes that Kabane is conflicting with that. So she starts beating him up, and what eventually ends up happening is she ends up ripping his necklace away from him, and all of a sudden Kabane ends up like growing horns, and all of a sudden his skin just starts to like seemingly like fall off the man, and we end up seeing that this character is becoming like a half monsterish creature. And so Yataro is like, oh my god. And so uh, she ends up running off. So eventually we have Kabane, who is to naturally assume that the monster or the person who had killed the chickens or the roosters could have just been him. And maybe that's what his aunt was trying to call this guy for, was to kill off Kabane because he might be the only real true monster here. So what ends up happening is that uh, Gohachi is to say, it's like, well, Kabane, you're not a monster. Like, if anything, you're human slash ghoul, and so you're not a real you're not a real threat here. There has to be something else here to really say that there's to be obviously something else here that is going to kill off these things, and it's not you. So they go off and they end up finding these ghoul deers that what ends up happening is uh, Kahashi is to tell Kabane that evidently these deers need to be severed off by the head to eventually try to take them down. They probably won't get taken down completely, but like at least they will have a difficult time for these things to be able to like reform or whatever. Um, like I was trying to figure out the exact title for these deer monsters, but the only thing that I could find was either ghouls or Kemono, which so I was like, okay, I don't quite understand exactly like. And it also seems like these deer don't change back into humans or whichever, so it just seems like these are just these kind of wild animals that evidently just turned into also monsters, which have these like weird looking smiles upon them. So the detective ends up shooting uh, these deer like to where all of a sudden like their heads come flying off, and we also end up having Kab- Kab- Kabane, who ends up also kind of like ripping certain heads off, also kind of like snapping their heads off and kind of like tossing them aside. And the detective's like, all right, like it seems like this guy is to like easily really just be helping me out. So what ends up happening at the end of this is the detective is to tell the kid while his cousin is to be thrown over his shoulder because she's knocked out. Uh, he is to kind of tell this kid that there are things out there that he might not understand. And so this detective is going to show this kid his butt to show that he has a tail. And it's like, okay, all right. Um, but yeah, so this guy has an ability, a weird ability to kind of like form things, and it seems like he can do any number of things. Seemingly, like I wonder how in depth the detective's power set is. Just that way, I can see like a biggest like scope kind of thing that he can just kind of create out of nothing. But I don't think we might get that anytime soon. But who knows? So maybe they'll save that towards the end when he really has to go and fight out somebody, and then we'll really see the in-depth thing of his power. So, so going on. So eventually, we had the detective who asked this kid, "Hey, do you want to actually like know where your parents are? Do you want me to like eventually help you find them?" And the kid is like, "No, just kill me." Because the detective is just like, well, I'm going to go and shoot you in the head and bring you to your aunt as evidence that you're dead, and then call it a day. Because really, this detective was meant to kill this kid and just haul him off. And so the detective shoots this kid in the head and brings him back to this kid's aunt. And so the next thing that we end up seeing is this Kabane. We end up seeing him in the back seat of this detective's car, and so the kid ends up waking up because this kid can't really be killed. So he has this kind of like Wolverine healing factor kind of going on, but like we really just see him having this like purple flame that kind of goes around whatever his wound is and heals most of the time. Or eventually, like we even have in one of these episodes where his head gets chopped off, and all of a sudden he ends up kind of reforming his whole entire body within seconds. And I'm like, okay, so this is really interesting. So the detective is to say like, yeah, I wasn't actually going to kill you, and I can't actually kill you that way. Like it was just to take you back to Tokyo with me, so that way like you can be a part of my detective agency because I need a guy like you. So we end up bringing this guy into the agency, and then all of a sudden we immediately have uh, these kids who are to meet Kabane, who of course is to be Akira, which is to supposedly be a boy that seemingly gets confused as a girl, because that's what Akira ends up saying. And we end up having, I believe, Shaiki or Shiki Tademaru Tademaru Tademaru, the spiderweb kid. Who like when they first bump into the when they first go into the agency that they're in, like they end up talking about pizza, and evidently Kabane has never eaten pizza in his life, and so the so Shiki ends up giving him a slice of pizza, and is to just tell him like, hey man, like if you've never had pizza in your life, you now have to eat this pizza. And so Kabane is like, oh, okay, it's fine, it's all right. So uh, so eventually pushing on. So this seems to be like the intro of all these characters. It seems like Kabane is to go uh, and at first kind of sleep on this couch, and he's completely fine with it. And like they're just like, God, this guy is like easily just like the most reasonable person like we've ever had here. And it seems that quickly but surely, eventually, uh, all this group is eventually going to become like fast friends just because of how easy that this how Kabane is so easy to just be okay with things and just tolerate a lot of crap from anybody else, to where it's like nothing's going to really affect him. Because there's this one part where Shiki is to eventually do this little web that ends up tripping Kabane, and he ends up getting stuck on this web, and so he ends up like ripping like his foot away from this web, and then Shiki's like, "Wait a minute, how did you get out of my trap?" And like, you also must have really hurt yourself. And then all of a sudden, the kid heals with this purple flame, and he's like, "Oh my god!" Like, okay, like so, don't mess with this guy. So, but like, Shiki just wanted questions from this guy, and just to, like try to figure out what is up with this kid and why is he here. Plus, also, like, he probably eventually wants his hoodie back at some point, but he's probably never going to get it. So, uh, so really, that's a bulk of what happens in most of episode two or episode one. So, episode two is to have these kids all go to this home. That all of a sudden there is to be this one room that is seemingly covered in these bugs, but it's not a normal thing of bugs. If anyone is to kind of go in the room who's like a normal human, all of a sudden they'll get eaten alive by these bugs. Or eventually, what really happens is that these bugs will sting somebody and kind of just like either kind of numb them up or kill them off or whichever. So that's not actually like a certain kind of people. So eventually we have the detective who is to think that maybe he can turn his skin into steel and go in there and try to take an item that seems to be the key factor of why these bugs were to all have gone into this one room. And so the detective is like, well, maybe there's a shot I can get out of there in time and be able to take this one thing and to drag it out of there to where it stops this whole bug infestation. But Kabane is to eventually just go, how about I just go in there? Like, I'll just go in there and I'll just solve this whole thing and figure it out. And the detective is like, okay, like, all right, go on. Like, go ahead. Like, it seems like he'll have a better shot than the detective will. So Kabane goes in there, and he is to just kind of, because at first Shiki is to try to use his webs to just kind of grab everything and try to get it out of that room. But eventually we end up finding out that the bugs are eating up or consuming all of this silk or this webbing. So Shiki is just like, well, crap. Well, I guess I'm not going to be able to like get anything out of this room. So, and again, what is Akira's power? What does she do? I guess I should probably like go and maybe Google that, because I don't know who this person is. Whoops. Yeah, I don't know what her power is, and maybe they actually showcase that, because in 3 episodes, I don't know what she does. Like they didn't show in 3 episodes what her power was. Um, so yeah, let me pause here and let me figure that out. okay, so Akira's power is, and we didn't see this in the first three episodes, but evidently Akira's power, like his power, is to do things with snow and like it's snow and ice and anything that's cold. I'm like, okay, so we and plus Akira is to have like a very like he can't control his power very well. And so I'm like, okay, so I guess that's a rare reason of why this person barely uses his power or uses it fairly sparingly. But I'm like, I guess because that character just has an overly goofy power, anyways, that why would they just consistently have this person ever use this? But like I guess they're just kind of like everybody is eventually like when they go through the show like what can Akira do? What can this person do? And they're just going to get annoyed with that just because it's like okay, like let's see what this power is. And eventually I'm sure they're going to probably dedicate a whole entire episode or whichever to having this person using this power. Um but Kabane ended up accidentally like saying Akira was a girl when actually Akira was a boy. So, like I pretty much would naturally just like Akira like does have like feminine features supposedly, but Akira is a boy supposedly. So, moving on. So the second episode is so what ends up happening is Kabane ends up going into this room filled with bugs, and so they end up completely surrounding his whole entire body. And so Kabane has this ability to not like feel any kind of pain or anything like that, or to not get wounded or whatever. Like basically, his time farming with his aunt kind of wiped out any kind of real like human side of him to eventually just become this person that just kind of had to work uh, like tirelessly. So Kabane is to kind of go through this room, get swarmed with these bugs to where he can't even see where he's moving. And so he ends up having to consistently like kind of push these bugs from off of his eyes so he can continue to move. So what ends up happening is Kabane ends up going and finding the item that that is in this room, lifting it up, and then all of a sudden the bugs all of a sudden disperse, and so they end up going off after all of this is over, and so the family seems to be fine, and so eventually we end up finding out that the item that was to cause all of these bugs were simply a pair of shoes. It's like, okay, that seems kind of weird. But then all of a sudden, the one kid in the home explains that what ended up happening is that the oldest kid's younger brother was to go to a place and shoplift these shoes for their mother because evidently this family is really poor, and it seemed like their mother really needed new shoes. And so this kid went off and shoplifted these shoes, but then when all of a sudden, like this kid was to realize that he had done a bad thing, all of a sudden this kid went on and became this like bug, Kemono, and all of a sudden like infected this whole entire room because of the guilt of him realizing that he did something bad. And so that kind of manifested this whole kimono thing, which he turned into bugs that surrounded this whole entire room. Um, so I was like, okay, that's really interesting. Kind of a simple story, but kind of intriguing. So the third episode is to eventually be that we have this woman who's called Inari, Yoko Inari, who is to be seemingly this red-headed woman that we end up seeing at the very top here, that is to have this girl who is to be named Cone. Like, funny enough, we end up having her with kind of little things here and there of like ice cream cones upon her hoodie. So it was kind of like funny how it was kind of like Cone, and her name was spelt a way of which to have ice cream cones all over her kind of hoodie. So, anyways, we have this girl who seemingly is to go into this police department and seemingly infect everyone that is to be in this police department. And it seems like this girl is to also who's to be Inari. She is to have this police badge, and so she's a legitimate police officer. But she probably uh, seduced her way, or probably like had anybody like pass her to get through any number of these things, kind of with flying colors. So to eventually just easily be a detective. So because I'm sure she used her feminine wilds to her kind of nth degree. Because eventually she has anybody like turning to her and being like her drone or her whatever. So, anyways, so this girl ends up in this police department, and so the detective is to Kohashi is to take Kabane to Inari, and we have Shiki, who's just like, dude, I don't want to go and meet her. Like, I don't like her at all. So, but Kohashi is to do this on purpose to just kind of see what Inari is going to do when she meets Kabane. And so what ends up happening is that Kabashi tells them to go to this police station, so they do. It seems that Akiri is to go on and take like a number of selfies. Like, I think that's, I guess, her thing, where she's to be like the selfie character. So, or he, Akiri, who's a he, my apologies, uh, is to be this like selfie character. So eventually we end up going on, and so what ends up happening is Kabani meets this Inari, and what ends up happening is she is to notice the life stone, and so she ends up asking for it, and Kabani gives it to her. And so she's like, oh my god, like, I need to figure out a way to like mass produce these life stones, that way, because it's supposedly preventing Kabani from needing to have this like thirst in him. So it's kind of maybe like vampires, where if Kabani is to not have this medallion on him, eventually he will need to feed or whatever. Here's the thing that does kind of confuse me about Kabane. There's this one part that we end up seeing in the intro where weirdly he changes his hair from black to red. I'm like, okay, why is that happening? Like, why is it that there is this transformation? Is that his kimono kind of working overdrive to eventually change like, maybe that helps him become a much more powerful ghoul character? I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what the hair transformation is. Like, I've seen Tokyo Ghoul before, and so I've seen where eventually where the main character has like black hair, and then eventually it turns into white. But like, I don't quite understand why a half ghoul character has to have his hair changed to red for whatever reason. Maybe eventually when we get to that shift or that whatever, maybe eventually they'll define what the heck that is, because eventually we have more episodes to go into here for. But the whole shifting of the red hair thing doesn't happen quite so soon. So anyways, man, if people have never seen Tokyo Ghoul, especially just the first season, like, the first season is really good, but then anything after that just goes way downhill, and it just is like, man, such a huge disappointment that like Tokyo Ghoul was such a really good first season, but then all of a sudden they do all this other crap that I'm just like, I just don't care. Like, I don't, like, I'm just so lost. and it just seems like a bunch of time has passed from the first season to these other new seasons, and I'm just like, man, they did a really good job with that first season, but anything that they did after that was just garbage straight up. But anyways, and plus the live action movie that they try to do was like, I'm gonna watch just the first season anime. Like they did not do a good job in the live action movies because they just don't. Anything that they try to do, like Death Note, Bleach, anything that they try to do live action, it's like, dude, the anime was better because they just have a strain on what they can do live action. Even though like they could have all the money just tossed into there in the world, it just doesn't put together good live action anime. You might as well just put the anime in whatever app to just say, hey, everybody, watch this. So moving on. So third episode. So what ends up happening is Cone ends up coming into the room, chopping off Kabane's head and putting his head in a briefcase because they want to keep his head in a briefcase so that way he doesn't reform his body in a short amount of time. I'm like, wait a minute. Couldn't Kabane just find out where his body is and just reattach his head to his body? Like, why do we have to have him all of a sudden reform an entire human skeleton and then also be without clothes in this show? So, anyways, what ends up happening is eventually we have Cone, who is to now go and have to take down Akiri and Shiki. But weirdly, Cone is to change herself to look like Kabane to throw these two other characters off. But then eventually we have Shiki, who ends up insulting Yoko, the redheaded girl, and so all of a sudden we have Kabane, who's Cone. Cone ends up getting upset and ends up changing into this werewolf, and then they end up realizing that this isn't exactly Kabane. Because funny enough, even with this guy who's kind of this like stone-faced character, they can still weirdly see that Kabane seems different, and then that's because Kabane is actually Cone. So all of a sudden now we end up having it where forcibly they're fighting Cone because Shiki ends up getting the briefcase away from Cone and ends up unlocking it and finding out that it's Kabane's head, and so Shiki is now freaking weirded out by holding this guy's head in his hand. And whenever Kabane is to just talk, Shiki's like, "Could you shut up because this is freaking weird. Like I'm easily going to be able to hold your head by mostly the ear." But like, hey man, could you just not talk? You're weirding me freaking out. So what ends up happening is Cone is weirdly like a weird like Sonic and Tails maneuver. She has like this tail that looks like Tails from Sonic the Hedgehog. So this girl is like going and blasting from the end of her tail like some fireball that is to go all over this building. And weirdly enough, there's all these people that are just frozen where they're at. And so this whole entire building is going to possibly burn down. And none of these humans seemingly have a worry in the world. And they're not going to move because they're all frozen because of this, because of Yoko, who has kind of just forced them to just kind of stay where they are and to just not realize what's going on. So what ends up happening is they end up trying to figure out how to beat Cone, but eventually Kabane just says like, "Hey man, how about you just throw me at her?" Like, it's like, what? Like, so Shiki is like, "Dude, I have to throw your head at her?" And he's like, "Yeah, just go ahead and do it." So he's like, "Okay, like, all right." So Shiki just throws Kabane's head at Cone, and so he ends up biting her on the shoulder, and Cone ends up just kind of falling over, and all of a sudden we end up finding out all these like flames and everything like that was just some weird illusion, and they all went away when Cone was to supposedly, I guess, be knocked out. So Kabane was to just be like, well, man, I thought I was gonna like actually bite off her shoulder or something like that. I thought I was really gonna do some real serious damage, but like they ended up kind of beating this girl down in the end. So it's like, hey, like a victory is a victory. So all of a sudden, Kabane all of a sudden is to reform his entire body, and weirdly enough, he has like a spine that's all like black. And so Kabane ends up reforming his body, and so Shiki ends up lending him his webbed jacket just as a like, hey man, like just cover yourself, man. I don't want to see your wang. No one wants to see that. So eventually, like Shiki is like, hey man, like we beat Cone, so hey, how about we give like a fist bump? And Kabani doesn't understand what that is, and so they try to do some kind of something, and Shiki just gets upset because it's like, dude, this should be like the simplest thing, and he can't even get that right. But oh well. So eventually they go on and like supposedly Yoko has thought that she had won because she ended up getting the life stone. She's like, yeah, like I have the life stone and I'm gonna go and mass produce this. But we end up finding out that she doesn't have the life stone. That the detective who is uh, Kohashi ended up giving Kabane before he left to go to this woman. He ended up giving her a like Kabani ended up giving her the wrong thing. Like it's kind of like the Star Lord switcheroo kind of thing, where eventually this girl opens her hand to see that it's some stuffed bear of a thing. She's like, "What?" Because yeah, like this guy was to pull a joke on her to see like what Kohashi was to pull a joke on this girl to see what she was to do, to eventually kind of see what side she was on. And now that he realizes that this girl was desperately trying to take this life stone because he talked about this with her to see what side she was going to be on when this kid arrived to her. And he's like, okay, now I see that she's just like going to desperately try to manufacture this thing. Okay, so I get what her real goal is. So I'm assuming we're eventually going to see this girl consistently popping in, trying to desperately try to get to this life stone, and maybe that'll have her eventually become the villain of the story, but I'm not quite sure. But it also seems that eventually Cone is to switch from Yoko's side to eventually coming to the agency side and eventually deciding that she's going to join with the Kemono agency so that way she can just kind of group up with them because evidently she has nowhere else to go because Yoko was like, dude, I don't care about Cone. Like, I hope she just ends up dying off because she failed me. Anyways, so like Cone is yet another person who ended up just getting abandoned. Plus, also, I think she was under the sway of Yoko's power. So, but it was kind of interesting how uh, the detective was trying to talk to this girl to just kind of talk up Kabane and just kind of see eventually what was going to happen with that. So yeah, so we'll see where this show goes. And holy crap, I've been talking for a while about this, so I'm going to get the heck out of here. Hopefully, people like this. Hopefully, people will be interested in the show. I know that there's some technical stuff that I didn't exactly go into. There's some ill pronouncing things that I've ill pronounced. And I know a lot of people will eventually just be like, oh, well, this is actually this, and this is actually blah, blah, blah. And that's bound to happen. But eventually, I will probably get more familiar with this show as the episodes go on. I know it's severely rare for me to ever talk about an anime on here, um, but this one was like heavily interesting enough for me to go into. Plus, it has this kind of like October kind of vibe to it. So hopefully, people are very interested in this show because I hope I can quickly go through and run through this first season, and people may be interested in it or people may not care because really I've just been doing one kind of thing on this channel. So anime may be too rare of a thing for people like, why did he go into this? Like, I'm not gonna watch this. Like, I didn't come here for anime, which is perfectly okay because every once in a while I just need to change it up, do something different, because I can't do the same thing every single day of my life. And some people may like anime. People might want to see whatever I am to talk about. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.